I don't really know what to say here. I don't know what to say to her.
Every story begins with belief. For the Browns, that belief was in something greater than themselves, a faith that promised eternal love, unity, and purpose. Long before the cameras, before the headlines, before the heartbreak, there was a dream built on the premise that love could multiply rather than divide, that sacrifice was sacred, that a family could be stronger because of, not in spite of, faith. When Kody Brown first spoke about plural marriage, his voice was full of conviction. To him, it wasn't rebellion, it was devotion. He wholeheartedly believed he was living God's higher law, a life of selflessness, spiritual strength, and eternal reward. And when each wife joined him, they weren't doing it out of weakness. They were believers too. Meri was first, with a torch of commitment. She believed in building something holy, a family that would mirror heaven. Janelle was attracted by the desire for purpose and partnership, drawn by the idea that faith could create order and imbue meaning in a chaotic world. Christine wanted love, community, and to be part of something divine. Robyn, the last to arrive, believed in destiny, that God had chosen her path, even when others didn't understand it. Jointly, the three of them made their lives based upon a single ideal. Plural marriage was not only righteous, it was a way to get closer to God. At the start, there was harmony. Not perfection, but faith-fueled optimism. They believed that hard work, patience, and prayer could solve anything. Every meal shared, every child born, every holiday spent under one roof felt like proof that they were doing something sacred. Their love was tested. Yes, jealousy and exhaustion and sacrifice were part of the life they'd chosen. But they believed that faith was the cure for every wound. If they prayed harder, loved deeper, obeyed longer, God would bless them. That was the promise. It was never supposed to hurt. For years, their faith had been the glue binding them all together. When arguments erupted, they turned to Scripture. When resentment grew, they turned to prayer. And when Kody's attention wavered, the wives turned inward in search of patience, humility, and strength. They believed endurance was holy, and for a while it worked. The Browns became the public face of modern plural marriage, a family built on love, laughter, and belief. The story attracted millions of people. Obviously, they saw their differences, yet their devotion. They were a living sermon of family bound by something that seemed unshakable. However, beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. Because belief, no matter how sincere, can't erase human need. Faith had promised peace, but it had demanded silence. It had promised equality, but it required submission. And slowly, the space between belief and reality began to widen. Each wife carried her own version of faith. For Meri, it was about loyalty. For Janelle, it was about discipline and purpose. For Christine, it was love. For Robyn, it was trust. And for Kody, it was control. Though he didn't see it that way. Not yet. They each thought they were serving God. But over time, they started to serve different gods altogether. The God of approval, the God of family image, the God of staying together at any cost. When faith became pressure, no one said it out loud. They just prayed harder. When love felt uneven, they blamed themselves, not the structure that required perfection out of imperfect people. Still, they stayed. For to question was to doubt, and to doubt was to sin. That's what faith had taught them. In those early years, faith was comfort. It gave their sacrifices meaning. When Meri's loneliness became unbearable, she reminded herself that this was her test. When Christine felt overlooked, she told herself to love more. When Janelle felt unseen, she doubled her work, believing that duty would bring peace. They were not naive, but dedicated. But when twisted by fear, devotion turns into something else altogether. Kody saw himself as a shepherd, guiding his wives and children toward eternal salvation. And in his heart, maybe he truly believed that's what he was doing. But the line between leadership and control is thin. When one person's faith becomes everyone else's rulebook, a promise of belief turns into a burden. And yet the Browns persevered, moving houses, building dreams, putting on a united front for the world to see. With every episode, every confession, and every tearful interview, The cost of belief became so palpable, but so, too, did the hope that it might still be worth it. They talked about love, forgiveness, and eternal commitment, and for years, they believed it. Or tried to. But behind closed doors, something was shifting. Faith was no longer lifting them. It held them hostage. It told them to stay when their hearts wanted to go. It told them to obey when they longed to speak. It told them to love when they felt empty. The more they sacrificed for faith, the more faith started asking for. This was the paradox of their lives. The thing that was meant to heal them was starting to hurt them. But none of them could admit it, not yet. Admitting it meant facing the hardest truth of all, that maybe it wasn't God who wanted this pain. Maybe it was just people. And so they stayed. They smiled for cameras and attended church, praying for unity while quietly falling apart. Faith was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the light that guided them. It was the shadow they couldn't escape. The promise of faith had become a test, and soon that test would break them. For years, the Browns lived by a simple truth: faith fixes everything. It was the belief that got them through arguments, jealousy, and exhaustion. Every struggle had an explanation, every pain a purpose. If you hurt, it was because God was testing you. If you doubted, it was because you needed to pray harder. But the cracks beneath those blessings were always there, small at first, easy to ignore. They started as moments, a lonely night, a look of disappointment, a prayer that went unanswered. Like water slowly eroding stone, those moments began to carve deep lines into their hearts. Faith had once been the reason they had stayed. Now, it was turning into the reason for their suffering. Meri was the first to feel it deep inside. As Kody's attention turned elsewhere, she told herself it was her trial. She believed loyalty was sacred, even when it left her alone. The bed she once shared became empty, her laughter faded into quiet, and the woman who once had so much hope began to live on memories. She kept believing. That's what good wives do. Janelle was the steady one, focused on stability. She managed finances and built schedules, carrying the family's practical weight. She rarely complained. Her faith was built on duty, the belief that discipline and perseverance were the holiest forms of love. But beneath the calmness, she was tired of managing more than her share, tired of explaining herself, tired of believing patience was her only power. Christine felt it too, the subtle yet constant ache of being unseen. Her heart had always been the family's warmth, but the warmth wasn't returned. Kody's visits grew fewer, colder, and when she asked for love, she was told to be grateful for spiritual companionship. So she turned that love inward, toward her children, toward her friends, toward anyone who reminded her what joy felt like. And then there was Robyn. To her, faith was still new and glowing. She believed in Kody's leadership with her whole heart. But the more she embraced him, the more the others drifted away. Her devotion became proof to him that the others were falling short. The wives were living in the same family but in different worlds. Each woman's faith looked different now, and that difference became dangerous. Where once faith had united them, now it was driving them apart. Kody started talking more and more about obedience. To him, the distance equated to rebellion, not pain. When he said family, what he meant was control. He wanted unity, but on his terms. His tone went from love to command, from we to I, from shared faith to enforced faith. When Christine confronted him, he called it betrayal. When Janelle disagreed, he called it disloyalty. When Meri cried, he called it weakness. They had been taught that obedience was a strength, that following a husband's spiritual guidance was godly. But that belief was starting to suffocate them. What happens when faith no longer feels like love, but like a leash? What occurs when belief is the very thing that keeps you from breathing? As the years went by, those little hairline cracks evolved into full-fledged fractures. Every time Kody made yet another decision without regard for their input, the space between them widened. Every time one wife was lauded, another was punished. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Plural marriage was a community, a family based upon and bound together by mutual respect and shared faith. In practice, it was an uneven system: one man, 4 wives, One set of rules that only seemed to benefit him. The wives prayed for patience. They thought peace would come with time. But it never did. Instead, there was resentment. Christine started to lose faith in the system. She couldn't imagine a God of love with a marriage founded on pain. Her prayers became less, her voice stronger. She stopped apologizing for needing affection, for wanting equality. And when she began speaking, the silence of the others got heavy. Janelle comprehended her. Meri admired her courage. Robyn worried about what her rebellion portended for the rest of them. Meanwhile, KODY was blind to the shift. He saw himself as the righteous one, the leader keeping the chaos at bay. He couldn't see that his version of faith had become the chaos. At one time, the women had followed him because of their devotion to him. Now they followed out of fear of being wrong, of being judged, of being alone. Faith, the very thing that had promised freedom, had now metamorphosed into a cage. And yet, none of them could quite let go. Because how do you stop believing in something that has defined your whole life? Meri couldn't. She waited and waited for a sign. Janelle continued working, Christine continued smiling for the children, and Robyn continued to pray that God would somehow fix it all. But faith, once pure, had been poisoned by expectation. They had confused faith with control, love with loyalty, and endurance with holiness. Every day was the same, one more repetition in the continuum of unspoken pain and polite prayers. They were still a family on the outside. On the inside, however, they were ghosts haunting the faith they once loved. Christine once said, "I thought faith would bring us closer, but now it feels like it's keeping us apart." She was right. The very blessings they had been promised, eternal family, unconditional love, divine purpose, had become burdens. It was faith that was supposed to heal them, yet it would soon hurt them in ways they could never admit. For to do so would be to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, they had been wrong. And that was a truth too heavy to bear, at least for now. Cracks beneath their blessings were widening. The foundation that once held their lives together began to shake. And soon it would collapse, not because they stopped believing in God, but because they finally began to believe in themselves. It didn't all come at once. A family such as the Browns does not explode all of a sudden. It unravels thread by thread until there is nothing holding it together anymore. The breaking point wasn't a single fight or decision. It was years of silence, sacrifice, and obedience finally catching up on them. The faith that had once given them strength had now become a battlefield. KODY's words, which at one time were filled with passion and conviction, now sounded like orders. Every conversation was a sermon, every disagreement a sin. Faith was supposed to be the wives' path to heaven, but it had become a walk through fire. When the pandemic struck, it didn't simply test their family logistically. It exposed everything they'd been hiding. KODY's rules became stricter, his expectations impossible. He justified them with faith, claiming obedience would protect them. What he wanted was control. He used the language of religion to maintain power. He spoke of unity, but he enforced separation. He said it was about safety, but it was about loyalty. Christine was the first to stop pretending. All these years she had bent under the weight of faith, and now she straightened her back. She asked questions nobody had asked. Why does obedience only go one way? Why is my worth measured by how well I follow you? Why does faith feel like punishment? It was her courage that made KODY furious, not because she was wrong, but because she was no longer afraid of him. In one now infamous moment, KODY declared, "I'm going to be the head of my household again." It was the spark that lit the fuse. To him, patriarchy meant order. To the women, oppression. For years, they had believed they were equal partners in a sacred system. Now, KODY was saying out loud what had always been unspoken, that he believed he was above them. The faith they had shared was fractured that day. Meri's eyes filled with quiet recognition. Janelle's expression hardened. Christine felt her last thread of belief snap. And Robyn, torn between love and loyalty, sat in silence, watching the family she prayed for fall apart. The word patriarchy became the dividing line between who would stay and who would leave. For KODY, it was a return to God's order. For the wives, It was proof that the faith they had followed had been used to justify control. From that moment on, everything changed. Christine walked away. Janelle began to disengage emotionally. Meri, alone already, began to wonder if waiting was still faith or was it denial now. But KODY didn't see it that way. He saw rebellion. He saw disobedience. He saw women rejecting not just him, but God. And so, he dug deeper into his own pride. He blamed their pain on their lack of belief. "You've lost your faith," he said. "That's why you're unhappy." But it wasn't their faith that was gone. It was their trust. Faith had become a weapon in KODY's hands. Every verse, every principle, every spiritual word twisted into proof that he was right and they were wrong. And that's when faith started hurting more than it healed. Janelle, always the steady one, finally raised her voice. "You use faith to control us," she said. "But control isn't love. It's fear." Her words were not loud, but they hit like thunder. All these years she had remained silent, and that is what made the cage even stronger. That night she didn't pray for patience. She prayed for clarity. Christine, now finally free, looked back and saw the truth. Her faith had been her prison, not her protector. Every prayer she'd said for peace had been a plea for permission to stop hurting. It was the moment she stopped trying to earn love that she found it within herself. Meri was different, though. It was her faith that defined her. Even after KODY rejected her, she believed that maybe faith alone could save what was already gone. But even she started to realize that faith without compassion is just empty endurance. And Robyn, the last believer, began to cry for reasons she couldn't explain. Because even though she still believed in the principle, she could feel it collapsing around her. The house she built on faith was sinking into the ground. The breaking point wasn't just about marriage. It was about meaning. Each wife faced a spiritual crisis. What does faith mean when it hurts more than it helps? How do you stay loyal to something that's breaking you? How do you love a God that appears to demand your suffering? These were questions they could no longer silence. KODY thought the wives were rebelling against him. In truth, they were finally being honest with themselves. They weren't turning their backs on God, but were simply turning away from a version of faith that demanded their silence. Faith had once promised salvation. Now it felt like shame. And when faith turns into shame, it no longer heals. It harms. That realization changed everything. Christine found freedom in leaving. Janelle found strength in standing up. Meri started seeking her own peace outside the family. Robyn stayed, still hopeful to rebuild. And KODY was left with what he'd always wanted, complete control, but no one left to share it with. Faith had broken them, but in its breaking, something new began to form: honesty. The moment KODY said patriarchy, he thought he was restoring order. Instead, he revealed the truth. He wasn't the head of the family anymore. He was the last holdout for a belief that no longer fit the world around him. And that's the thing about breaking points. Sometimes they're not the end of faith, but the beginning of something more real. For Christine, for Janelle, for Meri, and even for Robyn, it was necessary that the old faith die for them to find what was true. The pain of it all was not proof of failure. It was proof of awakening, because sometimes to find God again, you have to let go of the version that hurt you. Faith promises something in return, always: peace, purpose, eternal joy. But what if you give it everything and get only emptiness back? That was the question each of the Browns had to face once the dust of their breaking point settled. Years of faith had been their currency. Every sacrifice, every swallowed tear, every whispered apology to silence was a means to an end. Divine reward. Now all that sacrifice felt hollow. The prayers no longer felt sacred, but like echoes in an empty room. For Christine, the cost of belief was love itself. She had believed that with enough prayers, enough obedience, and enough forgiveness, KODY would see her again, not as one of many, but as his partner. She had built her entire worth on being a good wife, a faithful wife, a spiritual wife. But what did that faith give her? Years of loneliness, a husband who stopped showing up, a marriage that existed only in form and not in heart. Her faith had taught her to bear, not to cure. She said it felt like she could breathe for the first time when she finally left. But with that freedom came grief, not just for the marriage she lost, but for the belief that had defined her for so long. It's one thing to walk away from a person, it's another to walk away from a version of God you thought you knew. For Janelle, the cost of belief was identity. She had built her life around the idea that obedience was strength, that patience was power, that faith was found in doing what was right, not what was easy. But in that, she had buried her own desires. She finally realized that for years she had been serving not God, but expectation. Every decision, every compromise, every late-night prayer had been shaped by fear of breaking the rules, of being wrong, of disappointing someone who claimed to speak for God. And when that fear finally broke, she felt both lost and alive. She wasn't so sure what she believed anymore, but for the first time, her faith wasn't being handed to her. She was building it herself. Meri's cost was time, decades of waiting, hoping, holding on to a man who had already let go. Her faith told her that loyalty was holiness. That staying was a sign of spiritual strength, that God rewarded endurance. But endurance isn't always virtue. Sometimes it's just pain that's been given a holy name. Meri spent years praying for reconciliation, even as KODY withdrew further into resentment. The woman who once smiled through the pain came to learn that some prayers aren't meant to be answered because they aren't meant to be prayed forever. And then there was Robyn, the last believer. For her, the price of belief was guilt. She watched everything fall apart while holding on to the same principles that once held them together. She really believed in plural marriage, in eternal family, in the idea that love through faith could fix everything. But the more she clung to those ideals, the more she became the symbol of everything that went wrong, and she became the face of that very system that was breaking everyone else. And that guilt was unbearable. She cried, not because she was guilty of causing the pain, but because she couldn't fix it. And her faith had told her that love was enough, but love alone couldn't heal people who had already been broken by belief itself. KODY's cost was different. His faith had been his pride once, had made him feel chosen, special, powerful. Now, standing in the ruins of the family he built, his faith looked more like stubbornness. He wanted to become a leader, but had ended up all by himself. He desired obedience and lost love. He wanted to be followed, yet he had no one left to walk beside him. That's the quiet truth about control. It feels like power until the room is empty. Where faith becomes control, it is no longer about God. It is about ego. And in that way, KODY's faith failed him too. The cost of belief wasn't just emotional, it was generational. They saw their mothers, behind closed doors, crying. They saw the bitterness in their father grow. They saw the faith that was supposed to bind them together slowly becoming the reason for drifting apart. Some of them walked away from religion altogether. Others still held on to it, only differently. Gently, privately, without the weight of expectation. They loved their parents, but they saw the damage faith could do when it's built on fear. And that's the tragedy hidden behind every blessing. When you believe hard enough, you stop questioning whether belief is still helping you. Faith can build a home, but it can also keep you in one long after it's stopped being safe. It took Christine years to realize that love shouldn't be penance. For Janelle, it took courage to say that peace shouldn't feel like silence. It took heartbreak for Meri to find out that loyalty isn't proof of faith. And for Robyn, tears needed to fall for her to understand that faith without compassion is just control masquerading as devotion. They all paid the price, one by one. But here's the thing about pain, it doesn't have to be wasted. Sometimes it's the breaking that finally lets the light in. And that's where the story started to change. After years of following faith down a path of obedience, each woman discovered something new. A quieter, softer form of belief. One that didn't demand, but invited. One that didn't control, but comforted. It was faith without fear. the kind that didn't come from a man or a doctrine, but came from within. And maybe that's the cost of belief. You lose the old version of it to find the truth beneath it. Because real faith doesn't ask you to stay when it hurts. It asks you to rise when it's time to go. When something sacred breaks, it doesn't disappear. It transforms. Faith, to the Browns, had once been common ground, but now it was fragments scattered across 4 different lives. Each piece told a different story of devotion, of disillusionment, of courage, of rediscovery. This is what it looked like after the faith that hurt more than it healed. Christine found her peace first. Her goodbye wasn't loud, but final. She walked away from KODY, from the rules, from the constant cycle of guilt and forgiveness. For the first time, she did not leave to rebel but to live. And it was in that silence she found God again. Not the God who asks of endurance, but the one who whispers freedom. Her faith became simpler, not about structure or sacrifice, but about peace. She prayed in laughter, in the sound of her children, in the small moments that felt honest. When she smiled now, it wasn't forced. It was real. Freedom hadn't taken her faith away. It had finally made it her own. The transformation was slower to arrive for Janelle. She had spent so much of her life in the background, the thinker, the planner, the one who didn't need much. But as she stood in the quiet of her new independence, she realized she had never been as calm as she seemed. Her silence had always been survival. Now it became power. She stopped apologizing for being practical, for being strong, for not needing constant attention. Her faith redefined itself through resilience, the belief that God doesn't reward obedience, but authenticity. She still believed in goodness, in discipline, in grace, but she no longer believed that any of those things required her to disappear. She did not abandon faith, but reimagined it as strength. For Meri, it was the process that proved toughest. Faith had been her identity for decades. It had kept her anchored when love was gone and hope was thin. But faith had also kept her waiting, for validation, for forgiveness, for something that would never come. When she finally stopped waiting, it felt like betrayal, not just to KODY, but to the God she thought had told her to stay. But as time went on, she came to understand something deeper. That faith isn't supposed to trap you, it's supposed to transform you. She had spent years praying for her marriage to heal, not realizing she was the one who needed the healing. And when she started focusing on her own peace instead of someone else's promises, she finally found it. Her prayers didn't stop. They just changed. Softer, shorter, truer. She was praying for peace, not proof. For strength, not answers. And that was enough. Then there was Robyn, the last believer. For Robyn, faith was both her comfort and her curse. She still believed in the principles that had brought them together: eternal family, plural love, divine purpose. Yet she couldn't deny the pain that faith had cost. She was crying not for herself, but for all who had left and for the dream that had died in her hands. She had tried to hold on to belief, to rebuild something from the ruins. But rebuilding faith requires honesty, and honesty requires pain. In her heart, Robyn knew faith had been misused, but she also believed it could still be beautiful, if it was rooted in love, not hierarchy. She became quieter, more reflective, and while she stayed with KODY, she carried the ghosts of what was lost. Even KODY, for all his pride and anger, was left facing himself, the patriarch without his flock, the leader without followers, the man who had built his identity upon his faith and realized too late that control is not devotion. And perhaps, in his isolation, he, too, finally realized that faith without love is meaningless, and that love based on fear cannot last. The Brown story for years was about one version of faith: structured, strict, absolute. But life has a way of breaking absolutes, and what emerged from that breaking wasn't destruction. It was evolution. Each of them did indeed learn that faith doesn't necessarily mean obedience. It can mean trust in yourself, in love, in life. Joy became Christine's faith. Janelle's faith became independence. Meri's faith became forgiveness. And so Robyn's faith became endurance. And KODY's faith, maybe, then turned to reflection. They walked different paths, but they carried one truth in common. Faith should never hurt more than it heals, because real faith isn't about perfection, it's about peace. It doesn't demand silence. It doesn't punish doubt. It doesn't measure worth by obedience. It welcomes questions. It forgives flaws. It grows. And when faith grows, so do the people who once thought they'd lost it. It was never about religion. The Browns' story of love, which first was trapped in rules and then tried to survive in structure, is finally set free. The world watched them collapse, but maybe it wasn't a collapse. Maybe it was a rebirth, a shift of faith from being inherited to being chosen. And that's what makes their story so human. Because we've all been there, right, believing in something so hard we forget to ask whether it still is good for us. Staying when it hurts because somehow, in our minds, leaving equates to losing faith. But perhaps leaving is faith too. Faith that there's something better waiting. Faith that peace is possible. Faith that healing is holy. When faith hurts more, then it heals. It's not the end of belief. It's the beginning of truth. And for Christine, Janelle, Meri, Robyn, and even KODY, that truth was hard-won, but it was real. They each found faith again, not in each other, but in themselves. Because the most powerful kind of faith is the kind that sets you free,